Day 6, Off the Beaten Crack. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Join us once again in the hidden heartlands as we go back to the bogs here on Irish 2, our road trip made possible by our travel partner, Tourism Ireland. Let them help you with all the information and inspiration you need for your trip to the hidden heartlands or anywhere across the island of Ireland. It's all at Ireland.com. As we head into this episode, Martin, again, I'm seeing that theme of commitment to community, and we're reminded that what was once considered wasteland can now be turned into a resource.
Yeah, we just couldn't stay away from the bog, and so we paid a visit to the bog in Shinrone when we visited with Doug McMillan and Donny Reagan. And now we decided to get a very different perspective by hopping in our car and heading east of Athlone into the centre of Westmeath to the small and beautiful town of Tyrrellspass. And there, right in the heart of the town, there is an amazing 15th century tower house, which is now a restaurant, but it was in the parking lot there that we met up with our next guest, Eugene Dunbar, who is a retired geography teacher, but also heavily involved in a community organization at Tyrrellspass called Ethos. And we will explain all about that in the course of this podcast episode. And so, after spending the better part of a Sunday afternoon visiting Cloncrow Bog and the village of Tyrrellspass, we sat down with Eugene in his home. I'll let John set the scene.
We're in Tyrrellspass, County Westmeath, in the home of Eugene and Josephine Dunbar, who have graciously laid out a spread of fresh scones and apple jelly after a day spent tromping around the bogs of the area with the expert on bog life, Eugene Dunbar. Welcome to Irish Stew.
Thank you so much. A pleasure.
Eugene, I'm going to start here. You're a Limerick man, but you've lived, I think, 50 years in Tyrrellspass. How deep do you feel your roots are at this point? Because we were out in the bog today and we were looking at plants, and you were telling us the trees and the plants and the bog do not put down deep roots because I guess they would get swamped out with the water. So tell me about putting roots down in Tyrrellspass.
My roots are deeply embedded, really, in Tyrrellspass and in the Midlands of Ireland. Like, when you think of it, I'm from Limerick City, but really, I'm now 75 years of age. I really only spent 18 years of that life in Limerick. Then I went to Galway to university, and immediately after, I came to Westmeath to teach in the Midlands of Ireland.
We've just spent a wonderful afternoon out walking Cloncrow Bog and walking around the village of Tyrrellspass, and I always associate the word pass with mountains. But there ain't many mountains around here. So why is this place called Tyrrellspass?
You say there aren't many mountains because when you hear the word mountain, you think of an elevation. But a bog is actually a submerged, impenetrable pass. So on Cloncrow, we have 10 metres of peatlands, and it is just impossible to get through it unless you are passing through the glacial esker material that allows you to pass through this. So the bogs are actually as impenetrable as the highest mountains.
You say a bit more about what the esker really is. I think it'd be a new word to a lot of our listeners.
So the esker is an Irish word, actually. Geologically, the word esker, we have the finest examples of eskers in Western Europe here in the Midlands of Ireland. The eskers basically are sand and gravel ridges that came during and after the last glacial period. So as the ice was retreating, there were tunnels within the ice. The ice began to melt because there was a friction between the ground and the base level of the ice. So as the ice began to retreat and move, it retreated back, and rivers and tunnels emerged in the ice, and through these tunnels, water began to pour. And then when the ice eventually disappeared, these ridges were left isolated. Can you imagine that?
So were they the bottom of the river?
They were the bottom of the ice, but the river was encased. It's hard to imagine this. So the river is encased, the floodwaters are pouring through a cave system, basically. So it reverses the whole kind of logic of what we think normally a river is gouging its way through a landscape. But here, the river deposits are in fact left on top. They're left on at ground level.
Yeah, and so that creates a raised ridge, so to speak.
And that's why it can tend to meander as well, because it's a raised ridge that is subglacial.
So because of this esker, this is the pass between bogland.
It's a pass between bogland, but you get those ridges, but you also get, as the waters come out from beneath the ice, it spreads out over the local area and it actually envelops the whole area, not just as ridges, but as mounds, if you like, of sands and gravels. And this whole system forms a gravel ridge. That's how the eskers originated.
And the eskers in this part of the country are famous in a way because we're talking obviously about a period, the end of glaciation, when this is forming, but then humankind arrives into Ireland and then they use these eskers. Tell us about the history attached to the esker itself.
The eskers are intrinsically linked to the bogs as well, really, because what the eskers did was that they impeded drainage, basically, because pre-glacial rivers that would have flowed through the landscape here are now blocked because you've all the sand and gravel that's mounded up. It's like a big bulldozer moving through the area and creating all these mounds of sands and gravel. All the pre-glacial river system is now totally upset. So then you're going to get these hollows between these ridges, and it was within these hollows, in fact, that the bogs began to develop. So the bogs originated in shallow pools, if you like. They weren't big, deep lakes. They were just shallow pools where, in fact, the bog developed. So we're living here in an actual post-glacial landscape, which is really rich. And you can't separate them. The bogs and the eskers and the sands and the gravels are all intrinsically linked. For example, the Shannon River, which is the major river flowing through Ireland, that would have, at that stage, have formed an enormous lake that would have stretched from the present Shannon right over to where we are now. That sense of impeded drainage was also fascinating. When the ice melted, all that water was released and went flow down past the Slieve-Bloom Mountains, and then you're left with these hollows still, and it was within that then that the bogs began to emerge.
And one of these bogs is so close to the center of your charming town. When did you start to see this was maybe a resource that needed to be brought into the public eye, and you envision linking the bog with the town more closely?
I came here in 1972 as a geography teacher, and I was absolutely intrigued with the whole system of the bogs, and having one so close to us here in Tyrrellspass. I also became aware of Bordemona, because at that stage, Bordemona were exploiting the bogs.
Explain what that is again.
Okay, so Bordemona, in order to get at, if you like, this rich resource of peatlands, they removed all the vegetation and then they gathered the peat, 1 million tons of peat every year, and this was burnt in local power stations to generate electricity. And it also created huge employment in the locality, because when I came to Rochford was a bog village in the sense that the children in the school, the parents of the children in the school, the majority of them worked either with Bordemona, which was the peat extraction company, or with the ESB, which was the electricity supply company.
So it was a resource in one way as a generator of energy. Visions changed about whether that was such a great idea. And now you have this bogland right by your town. What brought you to the point, let's do something so people can experience this?
We are so lucky here because the bog that we have so close to us, it's 234 hectares in size, but it is what they term an intact raised bog. So in other words, the vegetation that's on it today is the same vegetation that would have been on it 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years ago. So you're looking at a unique landscape that hasn't changed in millennia. And that's the time warp, really. So when you step out on it, you are really looking at plants and you're looking at an ecological system that has evolved and that has been there for thousands of years. I don't think there's any other landscape like that.
Now, you used the term there, raised bog, and I'm aware of raised bog and blanket bog, but can you explain to our listeners exactly what the distinction is here?
Yeah, there's raised bogs and there's blanket bogs and then there's fens. But basically the blanket bogs are, as the name suggests, are a blanket of peatland. And generally speaking, they developed on the west coast of Ireland and some on the east coast of Ireland, where they blanketed the mountainous regions. They didn't develop in hollows as the raised bogs did. It's an upland phenomenon. And one of the critical distinctions is the amount of rainfall that is available. You could get up to 1,000 millimetres of rainfall on the west coast of Ireland, whereas in the Midlands of Ireland, you're down to around 500 or 600 millimetres of rainfall. So in an environment where you have this enormous amount of rainfall, the blanket bogs will actually thrive and will spread because they have a constant supply of rainfall. And the thing about bogs is that the building block of the bog is the sphagnum moss, and it derives its nutrients primarily from rainwater. So in an area where there's massive amount of rainfall and constant rainfall, it never dries out and it will spread, and it will spread uphill, downhill, into valleys and whatever. Whereas the raised bogs, there is less water available, but they will begin to develop in hollows. And they start off as fen peats, and then they will slowly develop into raised bogs.
It starts as a pond with water, and then there's an accumulation of organic material, and it builds up, and eventually the water goes away. But then what makes it raised? That doesn't sound like it makes much sense. And when you think of a bog, you think of it as in a hole, in a divot. So how does a bog become raised?
It doesn't make sense. And that's the fantastic thing about it. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever because it defies all our logic. Like when we think of plant life, we think of a root system, where the roots go down and they derive all their nutrients from the ground and the minerals from the ground and from the rock structure that's beneath. But in a raised bog, it's actually separated from that nutrient source. So the plants that will eventually colonize have to adapt to that incredible situation. The building block is the sphagnum moss, an incredible plant. It derives all its nutrients from rainwater. It doesn't have a root system, basically. So the rain is falling down and it absorbs this rain. It can hold up to 20 times its own weight in moisture, in rainwater, and it's actually taking the nutrients from that rainwater. This means that it is liberated from the ground, if you like, so it can grow upwards. This year's sphagnum will be a host to next year's sphagnum, and the sphagnum after that will be host to that, and a host to that, and a host to that. So it is actually growing upwards, which defies all the logic.
So when we look at the turf that's extracted from a raised bog, that is layer upon layer of compacted sphagnum moss is a way to think of it. And it can raise itself because it relies just on rainwater.
And other little mineral things as well, but we won't go into that. Yeah, but it's fed from the sky, it's fed downwards. But the other fascinating thing is that the sphagnum mosses will turn the water in its immediate environment acidic. So the water becomes acidic. There's an ionic exchange between the sphagnum moss and actually the water. And it turns it acidic, which means that no other plant life can survive in there.
So it's mean, it's poisonous to everything around us.
It is, exactly. And it supports its own self-propagation, if you like, so it can propagate.
And the interesting thing, as I understand about sphagnum moss, is it has a number of different uses. In World War I, it was apparently used to treat wounds.
And there was something I was reading recently, there was something like 3 million tons of dried sphagnum moss exported from Ireland to Britain, and then from Britain to the continent and even to India, because it's so absorbent. It has slight antibiotic kind of properties within it as well, but its absorbency, I think it's 4 times the absorbency of cotton wool. So if you put dried sphagnum moss on a wound, it can absorb the infection and whatever. And it was a big industry, actually. And in fact, a lot of the bogs, there was women, actually, primarily women, who went out and they harvested sphagnum mosses, and this was shipped off to England and from England to the war front. Yeah, incredible, like.
Hey, it's Martin. I'm going to pause our conversation here to introduce some audio recorded while John and I were out on the bog with Eugene. In this segment, Eugene tells how he and other members of the community at Tyrrellspass transformed what was once simply a source of energy into a community amenity. That amenity, of course, now is available for both visitors and the local community to enjoy. So we're just after coming in across from a beautiful boardwalk that stretches across the Cloncrow Bog, and stepped in a bit from the wind to talk about the actual boardwalk, because I imagine, Eugene, that this was a significant effort to build this facility. So can you talk a little bit about the community effort and what was involved in that and how it was financed and stuff?
Yeah, sure. It was always my dream to get access from the village, for the village community, out onto the bog. I just loved coming out to the bog, but I wanted to create something where people would gain access to it. I learned an awful lot from being involved in the Community Wetland Forum and seeing Clara Bog and seeing boardwalks. So we got a very simple idea initially, just to create a boardwalk for ourselves. But little did we know that it's more intricate than that. We wanted to do it as a community project rather than getting the council to do it or the government to do it. We wanted to do it ourselves, and we wanted the village people to feel this sense of ownership and not be coming along and say, oh, there's a tree down, get onto the council, get them to come out and do it. It's up to us now. We are the caretakers. We are the guardians of it. So the initial thing was we had to do some surveys. We had to do 2 ecological surveys. We mapped out, or we gave an idea of where we wanted this to go, and then we had to get an ecologist to come out and to walk that trail with us and to produce actually a very in-depth ecological survey just to make sure that we weren't encroaching in an area where there were really important plants. So we did that, and we got Joanne Diner, who's one of the leading ecologists in the country, and she conducted the survey. We applied for funding for it, and we were lucky enough we got funding. The next thing we did was that myself and another committee member, we did a course actually with Sport Ireland on trail design and insurance and all matters relating to trails, trail maintenance, etc. And that was the best thing we did. And from that, we got another guy to come out. He was working with Sport Ireland, but he also had his own business. And he came out and he walked this trail with us, and he picked out all the pitfalls, and he actually gave us a rough idea of how much it would cost, and he did an in-depth kind of thing of the materials we'd have to use, etc., etc. That was brilliant. So we had it on paper, if you like. So after that, we had then to see about ownership, because this whole bog is privately owned. It's owned by local people in the community. We had to get permission from the local people to encroach, basically, on their property. We had been in existence for about 8 or 9 years. Our committee had, our ethos committee, and we've been doing a lot in the village. We've been exploring different aspects of the local environment, the local history, the local architecture, etc. And people trusted us, and I think that was key actually, that we had the goodwill of the people. And anyone we approached and asked them, we're thinking of doing a boardwalk, oh, that's great, Eugene, whatever, and we'd be crossing your property. Their only concern was insurance. That was their only concern. Other than that, they were quite happy to give us permission and to sign a memorandum of understanding, which gave us permission. And this memorandum of understanding was to last for 10 years, and then it'll be renewed again. So we had that permission. Then we discovered we had to apply for planning permission, and that was quite involved actually. So we did that, and we got planning permission. And then we had to apply for funding, because we had no funding ourselves, just a community group. And the first year we were refused, but we were told it was an excellent project, but there were so many applications that maybe applied the next year. And we did apply the following year, and we got the funding. And we got, in fact, total funding for the project.
And who was behind that funding?
It was a strange procedure. You had to go through the county council, first of all, and you had to fill out forms about an expression of interest, and you had to tell them what you wanted to do. And then they fitted you with a source of funding. It's government funding, basically, but they fitted you with the most appropriate funding. Ours was the Outdoor Recreation and Infrastructure Scheme, and that's what we applied for, and then we were approved. So then, because the project was costing us over €150,000, we had to go for tender, and the whole tendering process had to go up on the web, and it was open to any contractor in Europe, but about 7 or 8 different contractors applied. And we went through a process then of selecting what we felt was the most appropriate one for us. He was relatively local. He's from North Westmeath. He had done boardwalks on different bogs, Cloncrow Bog and other bogs, so he was well experienced. So we selected him, and we had to have the criteria set down. So that was fine. And then basically he started the work then, and he procured all the timbers. He came in on September and he was finished the following March.
So soup to nuts from inception of idea
Yeah.
to completion. How long did that all take?
It would have been 3 years basically. It was a 3-year period.
Eugene, typically you're probably not out here with demanding podcasters asking you lots of questions about insurance and permits.
Yeah.
What's it like for you when you're just out here on your own? I was going to say enjoying the silence. It's not really silence. I'm sure there's different times of the year, insects and birds to listen to.
Yeah.
What's your feeling?
Oh no,
when
I
you come out here on your own?
I just love this place. I live very close by, and this is my walking trail basically. I don't think I did this for the community. I think I did it for
Now the dirt
myself.
comes out.
But I'm learning all the time. We became involved with the Care Peat project, which was done from University College Galway, and they were doing a re-wetting project up at the top end of Cloncrow, and we became associates with them because I think they needed to have this local community support as well. And I learned so much from them about the ecology and the plant life and how bogs are formed and just that whole nature thing. Personally, I am very interested in moth trapping and in butterfly monitoring, and I'm also a member of Birdwatch Ireland. When I come down here, I put out moth traps. If I put out a moth trap, I have to put it out at dusk and then leave it overnight. It's just a lamp really that's over a bucket basically, and then come back out again at dawn. And it's just incredible to come out here at dawn, especially in the early spring and even September, October, when the evenings are getting cold, and you'd come out and you would be amazed at the amount of spider webs. The whole surface is just covered with spider webs. And when you look out in the bog, you think there's no life out there. You're not going to see big reindeer, you're not going to see huge mammals. The life is all hidden. It's very discreet. It's insects, it's life, and you never tire of seeing something new. There's always a freshness, no matter how long you come out here too. And there's a great sense of mystery. The other big thing that intrigues me about the bog is we measured the depth of the peat out here. And in fact, we got out at the centre of the bog here, there's 10 metres of peat. So you put down these rods, 1 metre, and a metre of peat represents 1,000 years of growth. So you put down one probe, there's a metre down, now we're going back 1,000 years. Screw on another one down 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years. And you can go back, and I'd be telling people, especially the kids, the Normans are in Ireland, St. Patrick has come to Ireland, now we're down to the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Neolithic, the Mesolithic. You hear a crunch when you hit the bottom, you say, we're at the Ice Age, and you pull up this 10-metre rod out of the peat. That's fascinating, but the other fascinating thing is that peatland, it preserves everything that falls into it, basically, be that plant life, animal life, but also pollen. And that's incredible. As we're standing here now, there's pollen coming off all the plants that are around us here, even from local gardens. And those pollen grains are actually landing on the surface of the bog. And in fact, as the bog grows, those pollen grains are trapped. So in fact, if you took a core down through the bog and lifted it up, you'd be able to identify the history of plant life in this area going back from the Ice Age up to the present stage. You'll know when this whole area was covered with dense forests. You'll know what kind of trees were there. You'll know when there were periods of climate change because the sphagnum dies off and there's other plants, and then you'll get pines growing on the bog and then they vanish again. So that has been done actually at Cornahar, which is just close by. There's a pond out there, and the pollen record for this whole area has been logged there and identified.
Now back from the windy expanse of Cloncrow Bog to the comfy warmth of Eugene Dunbar's living room. Here's John.
Eugene, as we were out there today, I get the impression that maybe this was your own private joy to get out and take a glance at the bog for your good efforts and many other volunteers. Anybody can come and have this experience like we did today, because through what seemed like a simple project, but I'm sure was very hard to actually pull off, you've built an interpretive trail and you have a boardwalk that takes you very nicely over the bogs, and you can experience this because we want to let people know that they can see what your world is all about and they can follow this trail. What kind of spark was that where you said, I want to share this with people?
Yeah. I suppose as a geography teacher, I just found it instantly fascinating. I came from a city, from Limerick City, where we burned coal. That was the main source of fuel. And in fact, there was gas, actually, coal gas pumped into our houses through lead piping or whatever. Then I came up here, and the villages and the towns where you could get the scent of peat burning everywhere, and suddenly realised that there's huge reliance on the peat. And every summer, people went out and they harvested the peat and filled their sheds with enough peat to actually get them through the winter. So I found that absolutely fascinating, that there is this resource on your doorstep which you can use to fuel your home, to cook on, to heat. And heating wasn't done through radiators. It was an open hearth where you baked your bread and you cooked your meals, whatever. And it kept your house warm. It was only down the road, if you like. I was from a city and I'd never ventured up into the Midlands. It was as if you'd gone into a kind of a new territory, a new landscape where people lived differently. And then I became involved with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, and I learned a lot from them just about the flora and the fauna on the surface. And then became involved with the Community Wetland Forum, and then the realisation, which is very new really, that our bogs are not just a resource to be used and to be burned, but they're also a carbon sink. Because on our bog we have 10 metres of turf, we have 10 metres of peat that's accumulated, and it is pure carbon. Once you get down below 20 centimetres, there's no oxygen down there. So there's no plant deterioration and the carbon is just locked in. So you will find the roots of plants, of sphagnums, but of other plants as well, as deep down as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 metres. And they're holding all those nutrients, which in a normal soil would be available to the plant life on the surface. Now, I just found this is crazy stuff. It's a new religion almost. It's a new way of thinking.
And then you wanted to spread the religion to other people.
I wanted to, yeah, because people, I suppose, in a local community like here in Tyrrellspass, there's a romanticisation of going out to the bog and saving the turf. And there was this great communal thing. You went with your family and you turned the turf and they cut the turf by hand and all this kind of stuff. But this is now coming to an end. And people weren't aware of the hidden wonder that's out there. And I, through education, basically, wanted to reveal that, in a sense, to local people. That's what I like to do. That's why I love to get into the schools and get into the primary schools with the younger children and to let them see the wonder of it all.
You organized a beautiful trail for people to go on.
Yeah, myself and others as well. It's not just me. And also to link in with the knowledge that's out there as well. I don't know it all. I don't know anything. If I go down to the pub and have a drink and you'll meet people down there who will speak about the bog 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they'll speak about the grouse and the curlews and the birds that were there then, that they hunted and that are there no longer. You know, I've no concept of that because I wasn't here then. But it was, back in their day, it was a much richer place.
And so you and a number of other local folks set up a group called Ethos. Tell us what that means and what's behind that.
It was funny. It was at a committee meeting and we were debating what we would call it. Somebody said Ethos, and I went off and I didn't like the name, and then I began to think about it. I said, everything Tyrrellspass has on show. Because at that stage, this was before we had an idea of even developing a boardwalk, we were interested in exploring our local landscape, our local heritage, our built heritage, our natural heritage, folklore, our music and our dance. So we ran a lot of events in the village. We got in guest speakers. We had to speak about the eskers and about the bog bodies, and we had Aina Nilauna down from Mooney Goes Wild to speak about just plant life in general. And then we had somebody in just to speak about the architecture of the village. And we put on concerts of traditional Irish music. So we'd meet, we'd say, what do we do? And we'd come up with some ideas. And then, I suppose more recently, we took up the idea of developing this bog trail. And now we're actually at a stage to say, where do we go from here? Now what are we going to do? You know? So we're trying to come up with new ideas.
We saw a lot of built heritage today, but of the things you showed us today, what do you think will be high on your personal list? What would you look to and say, this is a gem that people would be surprised by?
You have the sculptures, really. You have the Imogen Stewart statue on the green. And then in contrast to that, You have the magnificent sculpture in the Church of Ireland church commemorating George Augustus, the first Earl of Belvedere. But the thing is that the Children on the Green is actually celebrating a totally different aspect of Irish history. It is celebrating James Daly, who was executed in India and whose body was brought back. And there's a very small, and it seems insignificant, but a very prominent piece of sculpture of 3 children crossing the green. And that's to commemorate this guy who was executed in India in 1920, and his body was reinterred back in the village again in 1970. That contrast, I think, is just turning the whole thing upside down as well. This juxtaposition of our Church of Ireland heritage and also the nationalist heritage. And I think this is a lesson that we've learned, can live side by side. And we have to appreciate this dimension. And it is literally side by side. The Church of Ireland, which is all the trappings of the landlord system, and then the Children on the Green is a memorial to what we'll call a martyr, but they're living together. To me, that is the new Ireland, you know.
An embrace of both heritages when they lived independently. And just a note to our listeners, James Daly, who was executed in India as a member of the Connacht Rangers, that is actually the basis of a book written by Coverty Madhavan called The Tainted, although she moves people around a little bit. There's an interesting connection moment there. I'm actually looking forward to sending a picture to her of this.
And Cover has been a guest on this podcast twice. A good friend of ours, and we hope to see her in a few days.
Because it was funny that Imogen seemingly was at a meeting in the village here with the people who were Republican, and they asked her, would she do a sculpture? But she refused to do a kind of a triumphalist sculpture, to be Celtic cross in the green or whatever, even though she had very strong associations with the nationalist movement, with Morgan and whatever, and she was German or Austrian, was it? But this was her idea of these 3 children walking literally into the future, you know, walking into a new Ireland. Some people just think it is naive, it's just children crossing the green, going to the local schoolhouse. But she had this wider image back then of a new Ireland.
And I think it's actually an extraordinary location what that little monument is. It's not just a statue, I think it's a little monument. This green, which looks like it could have been dropped out of Britain, I would say, more than Ireland. Can you talk about the surrounding, how that came to be?
The green, it is part of our Anglo-Irish heritage, really. One of the dominant landlords in the region were the Rochfords, who owned thousands of acres. I can't put a figure on it, but they were the dominant landlords in this area. The Rochford family, the George Augustus, who was the second Earl of Belvedere, he was married to this lady who was the Countess Jane of Belvedere. And she took upon herself to embellish the village, which obviously was there in a less formal state. And she brought in wonderful architecture. She put the steeple on the church. She built these neo-Georgian houses around the green. She put a pump in the middle of the green for the use of the local people. And she left money for the building of an orphanage in the green. But we have to remember as well that this was done for the benefit, basically, of the Church of Ireland population in the region, that the children in the orphanage were Church of Ireland girls who were being educated to work in the local mansions and big houses. At the same time, the Gaelic or Irish peasantry, we could call them, at this stage were actually living in dire poverty. That it was just a couple of decades from the famine, and many of them were driven to the borders of the bogs, actually, you know, where so there's that juxtaposition, but we have to cherish that as well. There was a time when people went around and they bombed and they pillaged. Any remembrance of that part of our heritage had to be stripped away. But I think in a more enlightened kind of age, we're beginning to see that this was our history, this is our heritage, and we have to embrace it.
Let's put ourselves in the minds of Martin and I showing up as 2 tourists in your town, and we run into you on the street. And we say, we hear this is bog. Where do we go, and what should we expect when we get there, and how long will it take, and how do we know what we're seeing as we wander through this? Would you tell them?
I would like to be with them, first of all, to guide them through it. And in order to do that, we use photography and to use QR codes and to try as best I can to explain what, before they go out to see what they're going to see. Got some local artists to do some paintings and worked with the local school children to go out and explore and to create artwork. And I think even if we don't go into the nitty-gritty of sphagnum moss, does this and that and the other thing, I think if you just step out there, suddenly you're away from that kind of routeway from Dublin to Galway, where there's cars flying by and there's buses and lorries flying by and they're belching out gases or whatever. And suddenly you're in this quiet zone. And if you go down there in the springtime, you're less than 5 minutes walk from the village, your senses are suddenly just awakened. So you listen to bird song, you're looking at plants beneath your feet that you will never have seen before. Carnivorous plants like the sungeon. And then when you delve even a little further, you find that all these plants have evolved to live in this harsh environment and to be able to live in this harsh environment where no other plant will live. And I think maybe there's lessons there, really. We have to learn to live in strange environments. Can you imagine people coming from the Ukraine or coming from abroad and coming to Ireland and don't have the language or whatever, and maybe their children will adapt and they will become more Irish than the Irish themselves. I think I explained to you that the bog is surrounded by a line of trees, of downy birch trees predominantly, and Scots pine trees. And they are actually just waiting for their chance to go out and to recolonise. And there's a wonderful geologist and ecologist, John Feehan, and John would say, be careful what you do out there, because Mother Nature has ways of actually coping. And if global warming, it is happening, if our temperatures are getting warmer, our summers are going to get drier, then the water table and the sphagnum mosses may not be able to survive. But if they don't, what is going to happen? That this other plant life will recolonise. And that has happened down through the millennia. If you cut down through the bog, you will see stages in its evolution where the sphagnums and the plant life has gone and the surface has been recolonised by woodland and forest, and then it got wetter again and the bog came back and demolished all this woodland, and it's a continuum, it's a changing environment really. And I think that's a great lesson in there for us.
We're now, sadly, at this point of the podcast where we have to introduce a character unbeknownst to you. And this character is called Seamus Plug. It used to be a segment called Shameless Plug, and this is your opportunity to plug something that is near and dear to your heart. It could be the Cloncrow Bog Walk. Maybe there's a website you want to share. So this is your opportunity, Eugene Dunbar, to shameless plug something.
We have developed our own website, Tyrrellspass.ie. But just for me, I just love the music, the language, the Gaelic language, and I'm not a native Gaelic speaker. I have Gaelic, I can hold a conversation, but I would love myself to learn far more Irish, and I would love to see far more Irish in our communities at the simplest level. Maybe it's just a sentence or two or a word or two. And we actually did that. We used to meet in a pub in the lounge once a week, and we would just speak in Irish as best we could, and it was the greatest fun. But what we did was that we brought with us somebody close to a native Irish speaker, a teacher of Gaelic or whatever, and we sat there, and if you were stuck for a word, she would come in. But even going up to the bar and just ordering a pint of Guinness, Oscailge, and people out on the other side of the bar were wondering, what the hell are these guys doing? But that kind of awareness of the richness of that, I'm starting to listen more acutely to Radio na Gaeltachta, which is the Irish radio station. And I'm finding that my ear is being attuned. The Irish language is incredible because if you go from Donegal, you find it very difficult to understand what they're saying. You go down to Connemara, it's a little bit more intelligible, and then you go down to Limerick or you go down to Kerry, I can understand what they're saying. But that is just dialect. It's not, it's accent more.
You're showing your Munster bias
I think
right
I am,
now.
yeah,
And I think, sadly, in this week, where we've lost a great exemplar of language and culture and tradition, Moncon Magan, who we were fortunate to host on the podcast, I think he will be delighted to hear you say that because, and I'm not sure if he used this, but the old saying is Berlum Gaelga Brishta no Berla Clishta. Just to translate, I prefer broken Irish than smart English. So the embrace of the language without trying for perfection is totally within the ethos, a different ethos this time, of what Monaghan expressed, and he will be dearly missed, I think, by everybody in Ireland that had the good fortune to cross his path.
And it is amazing, actually, because the airwaves, they're just filled with stories of Monaghan. He's not a superstar, but in his passing, people are beginning to realise how fantastic he was and what a great guy he was. When you think of it, what is the population of the globe? Is it 8 billion? And if you ask yourself how many people can speak Gaelic fluently, you're talking about, thousands, a couple of thousand basically. And this is a language that has been there since the bogs began. And, the question, should we lose it? How can you lose it? How can that be lost? And I think it is beginning to revive. And in fact, the revival is taking place hugely in the cities rather than in the rural areas. I was in Wales years and years ago where the Welsh Gaelic is quite alive, but it was revived through the education system. You would hope that people would suddenly realise, God, this is amazing, the songs, the poetry. And I'm fascinated by, you hear a sean-nós singer singing in Irish, and you really won't understand what he's saying or what she is singing. You won't understand it. If somebody sang a simpler song, you would. But to me, there is a mystery in that, how we can appreciate words and sentences and language that we don't know anything. And I was thinking about that recently. Do you understand what I'm saying in terms of the sean-nós singing? But there are words in there that even the academic Gaelgoers don't know. There are lost words in the songs, that have to be explained and have to be delved into. But I was actually thinking about that. I was a Catholic, whatever, brought up. And we went to Latin Mass, and I was a choir boy. And I sang in Latin. And I could, in tribu ab altarde, adelum qui latificat juventutem meam. You could recite the Latin Mass. And I think we've been programmed to appreciate the music that is in language, just the lilt of it and the flow of it. And if you let that kind of get into your head, it will actually unwind itself for you. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I think the Irish language has the layers of complexity that a bog also provides. And so, with that thought, on behalf of our listeners, John Lee and myself, we'd like to thank Eugene Dunbar for being an incredibly gracious host and spending a whole Sunday afternoon with us and bringing us through the bog, bringing us through Tyrrellspass, an exploration both geological, geographic, historical, and a couple of drinks.
It was an absolute pleasure, and I'm so delighted to have met you guys.
It was a lovely afternoon wandering through Cloncrow Bog, and through Eugene's good efforts and those of his other volunteers, we were able to follow the trail marked out with clear stanchions, nice signage to bring you into the story and the science and the ecology of the bog, great illustrations from children who experienced the bog firsthand, a walkway to lead us out over the bog with no damage to the bog itself. And what I thought, Martin, was a really nice thinking in terms of this trail was it's also the Cloncrow Bog and Village Trail, because it loops back into the lovely village of Tyrrellspass, and it ends up in a village green marked by a sculpture by Imogen Stewart, who you knew all about but was new to me. The 3 school children representing the future generations of Ireland. Something very evocative about that small but distinctive piece of art.
Yeah, I think it's a really positive piece in the sense that it is looking towards a more unified Ireland, which had been riven, as many people know, by sectarian tensions for hundreds of years. And so that small monument certainly is a more positive vision of the future. But the trail also did have the virtue, beyond that lovely monument, of running by a local pub called Willie's Bar, and it was thirsty work walking across that bog and through the village, so we did have to stop and spend a little time there.
What a convivial place. Small, you go in there, you're a stranger, but not for long. You're having a little conversation among yourselves, and then somebody kind of joins in, and pretty soon the entire place is having basically the same conversation. Terrific welcome there. And I think I got a nice picture of our barman, which we'll include in the show notes. Well worth a stop. Really great convivial place with a nice whiskey room as well. Highly recommended.
Yes, well, I'm glad to hear you didn't actually manage to record both me and Eugene singing there, which could come back to haunt me.
Let me check the archives.
A fabulous day. Eugene was incredibly welcoming, as was his wife, Josephine, who laid out some food for us, because after the bar, we came back a little bit on the hungry side as well.
What a treat to get that nice cup of tea and be welcomed into some folks' family invading their personal space. And another nice note in that house where they welcomed us was the artwork of Josephine all around. Really quite a nice artist as well.
Yes, and the podcast recording doesn't capture everything we did that day. We must have spent 5 hours, 6 hours with Eugene. And one of the wonderful things, quirky things that I wanted to do in the course of that day was actually go visit the Eskers. Because the Eskers, as we talk in the podcast episode, were the main highways through Ireland millennia ago. And so it just felt appropriate on our off-the-beaten-track road trip to actually walk some of that land, which we did. And so that's just another high point for me, a small thing, but quite beautiful. And Eugene very kind to indulge us.
And Martin, looking ahead to the next episode, that idea of an old highway resurfaces. Why don't you tell us where we're going next?
Yeah, our next stop is in the county of Longford. We're leaving Westmeath and Athlone behind us. And the wonderful hospitality we experienced in the Sheraton of Athlone. But we're moving on to make a stop in Longford on our way up to Leitrim, where we'll be doing more episodes there. But we stop off at the Corley Trackway, which is an old plank roadway that dates back to pre-Christian times, perfectly preserved in a bog. And we are hosted by Noel Carberry of the Corley Trackway Office of Public Works Museum. Now, the nice thing about Noel, he's a fountain of information on the trackway itself, but he's also an extraordinary musician, so you can look forward to some music there as well.
That was a real treat. So a couple more stops on the Hidden Heartlands road trip coming up. And for that, we thank our travel partner once again, Tourism Ireland. And also a big appreciation to our media partner, Irish Central. They're giving us marquee billing on the news, entertainment, culture, and travel website for Global Ireland, irishcentral.com.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.